Hello, my name is Marlena Lukasiak. I'm the artistic director of the KINOTEKA Polish Film Festival and a film programmer at the Polish Cultural Institute in London. Welcome to the very first episode of our new film podcast, dedicated to the extraordinary cinema of Andrzej Zulawski, one of the most uncompromising and visionary filmmakers in European cinema. Often described as the enfant terrible of Polish cinema, Zulawski was renowned for his feverish visual style, emotionally charged storytelling, and fearless exploitation of love, obsession, desire, and madness. Over the next 3 months, from August to October, London audiences will have a unique opportunity to discover or rediscover his remarkable body of work as part of the Andrzej Zulawski retrospective at the Garden Cinema. Today, we are joined by two special guests who will be discussing Andrzej Zulawski's personal life, work, and enduring legacy. The first one is Daniel Bird, writer, filmmaker, and the author of The Making of Possession. And the second is Adam Zulawski, editor, writer, and translator, who not entirely coincidentally shares the same surname as the legendary filmmaker.
Hello and welcome to the podcast from the Polish Cultural Institute in London. And my name is Adam Zulawski and I'm here with Daniel Bird.
Hello, Adam.
So we're talking today because, firstly, I am related to Andrzej, and Daniel is his longtime associate, collaborator, friend, the consigliere. I think it's a list of all the possible things. And we've known each other for years, haven't we, Daniel?
I think it all started, I'd seen one of Andrzej's films, his most famous film, Possession, and it made quite an impact on me. It wasn't easy to see that particular film. It wasn't readily available. I remember having to write a check to a guy who made copies of a Dutch VHS cassette and mailed it to the post. So I got to see Possession with Dutch subtitles and this very scratchy, ugly tape. But I was quite shocked by the performances in the film. It really made me very nervous. The use of dialogue, the way language was used in conversation was in no way naturalistic, which both intrigued and annoyed me. And also, I thought it had a very distinct look. It was very blue. And it had a very precise, unusual approach to framing the action, and the camera was always moving. And it had this very bizarre score, which was a kind of mixture of Japanese sounds with synthesizer disco music, with a melody which was clearly very, very influenced by Nino Rota's music for The Godfather. And I thought, this is the strangest but most compelling film I'd seen, and I had so many questions, and I wanted someone to answer those questions. And I thought, what better person to ask than the person who wrote and directed Possession? The question was how to get in touch with him, and this is long before the internet really kind of became useful for that kind of thing. So I just started my undergraduate degree at Kiel University. I was studying psychology and philosophy, and one day when I was going into the library to do my weekly reading, there was a bank of phone books on the left-hand side of the foyer. And for strange reasons, which I don't quite understand, I sort of instinctively headed towards the phone book for Central London and thought, maybe there's a Zulawski in London and maybe it's the same family. And there was a listing for your dad, Marek Zulawski, in the phone book. And I called the number and ended up speaking to your mum. And by complete chance, at that very moment, Andrzej's brother, Łukasz Zulawski, he gave me his number, Andrzej's number in Paris.
It's quite funny that in the phone book, this was like 1997 or around
Yes.
then. And it's still listed my dad.
Yes.
He'd been dead for over 10 years. So those phone books weren't always up to date.
They certainly weren't, but it did lead to an awkward opening conversation along the lines of, can I speak to Marek Zulawski? No. Why not? Because he's been dead for 12 years. Oh, and well, your mum was very understanding of this misunderstanding. So yeah, I did. I arrived in Maida Vale in Marek Zulawski's studio, where your mum lives and where you lived, and she explained the family history and how there's not just one Zulawski, there's a whole lot of them. It all belonged to a noble Polish family full of writers, painters, musicians, politicians. She became a guide towards this aspect of Polish culture, and she was very generous in terms of loaning me books. She gave me an unpublished English translation for On the Silver Globe, the first part of the Luna trilogy, which Andrzej famously or infamously attempted to film in the 1970s. And I was very interested, given the fact that this trilogy of books was written by your granddad, Marek's dad, Jerzy Zulawski, and that not only was this the first Polish science fiction book, but it was also written by someone who was a philosopher. So I felt a connection there. And she put me in touch with Juliusz Zulawski, who was at the time the head of the Pen Club in Warsaw. And he was kind enough to photocopy me a book in German, which was based on Jerzy's doctoral thesis on Spinoza. So yeah, I have a lot to thank your mum for in that respect.
That's quite an intro. But I do have a question. Did you understand German?
I'd done German at school, and I kind of thought, well, probably with a dictionary I'll make some sense of it, but 30 years on, it's still on my to-do list. Yeah. But it was. I think that yeah. I mean, your granddad was instrumental in terms of popularizing Spinoza, with this turned into be a very general book, which was influential in Polish circles, and he'd also translated some incredible things as well, which I think I would say, and this is just pure speculation, I think set a very high bar for Andrzej to emulate, and I think the one thing that I would say underpinned not just our relationship, but my understanding of him, is that today we know Andrzej Zulawski primarily as a filmmaker, but he was also a writer, and I think that really is connected to the fact that his father, Mirosław, was a writer, and there were writers like Juliusz, and there were writers like Jerzy in the family. So filmmaking was in some way an extension of literature. And Andrzej used to say that he was a writer who directed, and also when he was not directing, he would write books. So that's how he perceived himself. He saw filmmaking as a function of literature in that respect.
Yeah, I can see that. And that, you know, I mean, he wrote all his screenplays as well, didn't he? So I don't know if his process writing screenplays and his books was the same or not.
Well, some of the books were unfilmed screenplays. There was one book, Byl Sad, which is a reference to Pan Tadeusz by Adam Mickiewicz, Poland's national poet, and that began life as a film script written in French, which around the time of Possession, just before Possession was made, which was initially conceived of as a French-Polish co-production. And even though the French producer made attempts to deal with Film Polski, this is a time when cinema was nationalized and it was still a time of communism. That didn't work out, but the story meant a lot to Andrzej. So in the mid-1980s, he adapted that into a novel, which was initially published in French, but the Polish original only appeared in the 1990s. So there is a relationship, I think, between Andrzej's books and his films, but the majority of his films are adapted from literature. It's actually the films like Possession are the exceptions. The original screenplays, the majority of them are adapted. Like his final work, Kosmos, is adapted from the last book of Witold Gombrowicz, who I think is another Polish literary figure who is incredibly important for Zulawski.
So just get back to the timeline. So my mum introduced you to Andrzej's brother, Łukasz, because we all lived in London at the time.
So Łukasz gave me the telephone number to Andrzej in Paris, and I called him. And this was the time when his film Szymanka was being released in French cinemas. So he gave me the number of the publicist, a guy called Robert Shlokov, and I called him. And he was very happy because there hadn't been much positive press, let's say, surrounding the French release of Szymanka. So when I came along, he was very keen to set up an interview with Andrzej to help promote the film. I think at the time there hadn't been a sustained or an English language interview with Andrzej, so I think it was a novelty for him as well. So I went to Paris with a friend, Stephen Trower, who's a musician, but he also edited a film fanzine, let's say, called Eyeball, which focused on extremes in cinema, so extreme art or extreme trash and absolutely nothing in the middle. So Andrzej was like the perfect director for Eyeball magazine. It was something incredibly highbrow and lowbrow at the same time. It was the opposite of middlebrow. It was intimidating and extremely vulgar. So he was an object of fascination for us. And we met him in the hotel lobby of a place not too far from the production office, but also where he was living with Sophie Massot, his partner at the time, on Avenue Malakoff in Paris. He talked for the best part of 2 to 3 hours. It was absolutely fascinating and exhilarating. He was incredibly generous, incredibly charming, and it gave me a completely different outlook on not just his films, but cinema and its relationship to literature, politics and history. And it made me realize that this was a very, very unique and unusual filmmaker. This was around the same time as Tarantino. It was really kind of like the hot filmmaker. And it, in some ways, I've got a lot of time for Tarantino and particularly, his very early films, but it was the complete opposite. This was not a guy with a massive video collection doing riffs on pop culture. This is someone who was just quite happy to talk about philosophy, psychiatry, religion, and how all this related to politics, which kind of makes sense when you think of how all those things are mixed together in Poland, particularly during the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
So he wowed you with his knowledge and chat. But then, what was your impression of him as a person?
He was very, I would say, disarming in the way that he was clearly very erudite. At the same time, certainly in academia, there's a lot of highfalutin language which kind of obscures or hides sometimes an emptiness. And Andrzej was the opposite. He was able to address quite complicated, intimidating subjects, but in a very straightforward, precise, clear language, and also mixed with a kind of a warmth. And so it was really expanding all sorts of horizons about what is possible, what to read. And I think that's something that lasted for a good 20 years. Every time I would meet Andrzej, I would come away with a list of mainly books to read and films to watch, but mainly books. I don't know anyone as well read as Andrzej, and I think that was really a lesson I learned. Yeah, read as much as you can, and see as much as you can, and not just films, but paintings, galleries. And I think this is something which I got to experience firsthand. He was a very disciplined person in that respect, in terms of his work ethic. The day would begin with writing, and then the afternoon reading. And it would be broken up. If you were at a festival, for example, with a trip to a gallery or a museum, every moment didn't go to waste in that respect. And if he found himself in a situation which he felt his time was being wasted, if a conversation wasn't interesting or you were being boring, he would make it very clear and and leave. So when you were no longer useful to him and the charm disappeared, you got a different side of Andrzej, the abrupt, direct Andrzej, which as a member of the family, I'm sure it's not unusual to hear about this side.
No, that sounds familiar. But I was just going to ask you about Szymanka, because he did it thinking it was helping promote Szymanka. But I remember watching Shamanka as a teenager, and I really hated it. I actually really didn't enjoy it at all. And I have a feeling that might have been generally an issue with that film. And what happened with that interview?
Well, you are not alone in that respect, Adam. I think a large part of Poland hated Shamanka. I think it's important to explain what that film is. It is being screened in this season of Andrzej's films, which are playing in London. The screenplay for Shamanka is by a Polish novelist, Manuela Gretkowska. She'd studied anthropology in Warsaw, but she'd met Andrzej in Paris, and he encouraged her to write a screenplay. And it began with an anecdote. She was telling a story about a friend who'd had an affair with an anthropology professor, and he'd broken off the affair. And she said, "I could eat his brains." And Andrzej said, "That's your film. It's about a woman who has an affair, and it ends with her eating his brains." So he kind of not only encouraged her, but gave her the structural components of screenplay writing. And Gretkowska wrote the script. Initially, this is the mid-1990s, so a transition period from cinema being controlled by the state to cinema being made as a private enterprise. So the first port of call for getting money for such films was Polish television. And they read the script and said, "This is pornographic." And Andrzej, in a broadly political gesture, said, "That's fine. I live in France. We use private money, so we'll make it anyway." So he saw the fact that money was being withheld by Polish television as something akin to censorship, not that different from the censorship he'd experienced in the communist period. So he went away and found a producer who put together a very elaborate co-production involving private money in France, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Poland. And he made the film anyway. And yes, it appeared in cinemas. It outraged Catholics. It outraged everyone because of its sexual explicitness. There were all these stories in Polish newspapers about how Andrzej had mistreated the lead actress in the film, who he discovered as a student, and she's frequently naked, doing not just sexual scenes, but cannibalism, obviously. So there was this nothing but scandal about the film in Poland. I think it was already damned before it came out in cinemas. And I remember going, as part of my researching my subject, going to the library of the Polish embassy, and the librarian told me that she'd done her doctoral thesis on Zulawski's films. It was a Jungian interpretation of his work as a filmmaker. But this last film he made, Shamanka, was absolutely terrible. So I was really, really intrigued about this film. And so when Steve and I went to Paris the day before we interviewed Zulawski, we went to the last cinema in Paris that was screening it. It was the Espace, which is a small art cinema in Saint-Michel. And we watched Shamanka. At the time, they used to post newspaper reviews in the foyer. And I mean, they were just like comically kind of negative. Like, if anyone sees Zulawski approaching a film camera, just please shoot him with a tranquilizer gun. It hadn't gone down well in the French press at all. And so Steve and I watched the film. We got the times wrong. So what better way to actually kill 2 hours than just like drink really strong Belgian beer. So we actually watched the film, under the influence, and we were just laughing throughout. I mean, this was just like the ultimate film. I mean, it was just as offensive as we'd hoped it would be. And I think it's important to stress that everybody loves Possession now. Possession's been remade. It's everybody's favorite film. But the reason I was attracted to it as a 16-year-old was that everybody hated this film. I mean, it was just so offensive, the idea that here is a film which is clearly an art film, but it just pissed off everyone who was into art cinema. And it also pissed off everyone into horror films because it was just too pretentious. And I thought, this is wonderful. It's the perfect film for the type of 16-year-old I was. It was a film that upset everybody. And here, he'd made another film in Poland, which was upsetting everybody. So it was just like the perfect film to see. And it was incredible to then actually meet the filmmaker afterwards the next day with a hangover I remember asking, the first question more or less is, how do you get people to act like that? And Andrzej said something along the lines of, that's like asking a shoemaker how he makes shoes. I can't answer that. But at the end of the interview, he said, if you're really interested, you should go to Poland.
And you went to Poland immediately? That's what I'm assuming.
This interview, it was during my Easter break, and I planned my trip to Poland, which was a little bit more complicated than it is now, because this is the time before Poland was part of the European Union. It just meant that there were less flights and it was a little bit more expensive. And frankly, it seemed incredibly exotic to me at the time. So yeah, I flew to Poland for 1 week during my summer holidays. I was working at a call center in Stoke-on-Trent, sort of frantically saving up for this 1 week. And then when I came back, paying it off. And yeah, it was a really fascinating experience to see Poland barely 6 or 7 years after the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc. And it was still rather grey at that point, but there were little things like McDonald's, which were sort of glaringly incongruous and which were fetishized. They were sort of beacons of capitalist hope at the time. It seemed like hell to me eating at McDonald's, but I quickly realized that in Poland in 1990s, it was the place to go. So it was a very interesting experience. And my points of connection in Poland were people interested in music. I'd come into contact with a guy who worked for Polish Telecom, who on the side was running a music label. And then he put me in touch with various people in the Polish counterculture and anarchist circles. And they in turn sort of framed how I perceived Zulawski. A guy called Darek Mishuna gave me 2 really good pieces of advice. And the first is that I should probably look into this guy, Jerzy Grotowski, who does something very similar in theatre. And also I should read Witold Gombrowicz. And I did those 2 things. And I still think that was the best piece of advice I had in terms of making sense of my interests.
So you now, after this trip to Poland, you now sort of understand the context perhaps a bit more. And then when was your next encounter with Andrzej?
Well, I came back with this long interview and this experience in Poland when I was able to actually pick up some of his other films like The Devil, Diabeł on VHS. I remember going to a kind of a state video store. It was on Puławska Street. I mean, the whole of the state film industry is all on one address, Puławska 61. And they had a little shop where you could buy Polish films from the communist era. They all have sleeves which were identical. They all had these blue sleeves with like a generic typeface and a rather banal photo from the film. But it was there that I was able to actually get a copy of The Devil. None of these were subtitled, which was probably a good thing because these films are not about the plot. They're about the experience. And I think that maybe if I understood what was being said, I would be less interested in the films. But what I was interested in was the expression, the bodies of the actors, the shrill expressions, the screaming. And I thought, well, actually, that's what's interesting about these films. What's being said is, it could be interesting. And with the benefit of hindsight, it's actually less interesting. I think it was a good thing. I think this was my main advantage over a Polish audience is that I didn't actually know what was being said, but I was focusing on the expression. And I think that really relates to this great piece of advice I'd had about Grotowski and Gombrowicz. So Grotowski was a theatre practitioner in Poland, and he was rolling with the punch. There were very few resources in Poland at the time. People were poor. So he thought, you know what? Let's make a poor theatre. Let's not bother with lights. Let's not bother with costumes. Let's strip every superfluous aspect of the theatrical experience to the bare minimum, which is ultimately the body of the actor, their voice, and their soul, quite frankly. And I think that this is an interesting aspect of both Grotowski's work and Zulawski's work. Grotowski, as written about by the English director Peter Brook. Peter Brook wrote a book called The Empty Space, and he talks about 4 different types of theatre. And in discussing Grotowski, he talks about a religious theatre. Andrzej saw acting as religious. He saw shamans as the first actors. So a shaman acts out a sort of a battle in another world in front of an audience, and their job is medicinal. They are healers, not just entertainment. The spectacle is a byproduct, but their role is fundamentally therapeutic for the community. And this is something which Grotowski elaborated on in terms of forging this association between theatre and religion. And it's something which Andrzej did in a bit more vulgar fashion in his films. The one thing which Grotowski demanded from his actors is 100% commitment. And when I say that, I don't mean 100% professional commitment. He wanted everything, every living, waking breath to be dedicated to the performance. In Andrzej's case, it was throughout the duration of the production. After that, the actors could go home. But during the shooting of a film, he wanted absolutely everything, specifically from the actors. And of course, some actors found this beneficial, others found it exhausting. And there are lots of stories about that. Some actors who were almost destroyed or even destroyed. And then there are other actors who found it the most exhilarating experience of their careers. So I came back and I went to the same Polish library, and they had a communist era book, this mass-produced book promoting Grotowski's theatre. So they gave me a spare copy, and this became like a talisman with these photos and with these texts. And I became incredibly fascinated about this. And I thought, it's time to publish this interview, but there's a fundamental problem. These films weren't in distribution, so what's the point in publishing an interview with a filmmaker whose films you can't see? None of them were on video. They weren't in distribution. So I went to the Polish embassy and said, let's do a season of Zulawski's films in London. And they say, that's great, but we don't have a cinema. So I thought, well, Zulawski made half of his films in France, so I'll try the Institut Français, and they have a cinema, the Cinema Lumière. And the programmer there said, that's great. Let's do a weekend with Andrzej Zulawski and let's screen 5 films. The first night will be Szymanka, and then we'll have 4 films over the weekend. And we chose Andrzej's first film, The Third Part of the Night, which is partially based on the memories of his father, Miroslav, when he was working in the Home Army, the AK in Lvov, and Possession. And those 2 films make a nice double bill. And then on the Sunday, we had L'Important c'est d'aimer and also Mes sont plus belles que vos jours. The most important thing is to love, and My Nights Are More Beautiful Than Your Days, both of which star Jacques Dutronc. And that was the program. And so Andrzej came across with Sophie Marceau. This is a time before DCPs, so we only had Polish version of Szymanka with French subtitles. And back then, you just had to rough it out. If you turned up, you didn't get English subtitles. So the majority of the audience which turned up were Poles in London who were mainly familiar with your dad. And this was a very different audience to Andrzej's audience. And they were quite comparatively conservative. And I think they were quite shocked. We went for a meal during the screening when Andrzej got into a fight with a drunk Polish photographer and punched him. And so it felt like this experience of putting on the season was turning into a Zulawski film. So we came out of the meal and it was time for Andrzej to take questions from the audience. A Polish woman ran up to the front of the stage, crying, screaming. The gist of what she was saying is, what right do you have to film my home like that? And Andrzej said or shouted, listen, lady, I live there. You don't. You live in London. You know, this is Warsaw. This is today. And she ran out screaming. And I thought, this is just amazing. You know, it's just like in real life, this is like the films. And the whole business of actually organizing film seasons has been downhill ever since. I've never had so much fun and terror organizing one of these events as I did back then with that first screening.
It sounds like fun. I have to say, I asked my mum about that incident, and she told me that she does remember it. She was sitting next to Ivanka, Lukasiak's wife, and there was another lady there, and this photographer came up, and he was just being like very, very rude to this woman, apparently. And so my mum said when Andrzej punched the guy, he did the right thing.
I think it was unanimous. He was very polite about it in the way that basically I remember I'd asked him a question about Joseph Conrad and he excused himself, punched this guy, and afterwards he continued answering my question about Joseph Conrad, which impressed me, this multitasking. And then afterwards, after this whole incident, he invited me to the French ambassador's residence where he was staying with Sophie. I did my second interview with him. It was all very glamorous, or it seemed to me that way. I entered through this elaborate security and there was a fashion photo shoot with Sophie. It was just how I'd imagined. I mean, you were being waited on constantly by the staff while we had this conversation. And during the course of that conversation, Andrzej said that Sophie had been cast as the heavy in the James Bond film and that he was going to be living in London and that he was going to use this time to write his next film. So at this point, I asked him, I said, I was interested in filmmaking in Poland and I'd like to go to the famous Łódź Film School. And he said, don't bother, just watch me make a film instead. That'll be a much better education, and continue studying philosophy. So that's exactly what I did. I started a master's in philosophy at Warwick University, and then I was traveling down to London whenever I could to meet Andrzej, and he would be there answering all sorts of questions, not just about cinema, but literature and philosophy. It was quite bizarre. I remember going into this house rented by the production. They had like a TV with a pile of books and videos, and one was Straw Dogs by Sam Peckinpah, which was technically banned back then, and then a bunch of books on Schopenhauer. And I think that sort of crystallized the kind of breadth of Andrzej's interests, Straw Dogs and Schopenhauer. We would go for walks and there was all sorts of like bookshops, and then he would actually suggest things to read and buy books on occasion, some of which I still have. And then when it came time to make the film, I said, well, can I come to the set? And he said, of course. And he said, if you can get to Paris, I'll arrange the production to pick you up, drive you to the set, and you can watch, talk to the crew members, talk to the actors, make as much out of the experience as you can. So yeah, during reading week of my master's, I took a Eurostar to Paris, and exactly as Andrzej said, someone picked me up. And then suddenly I was it was a university campus, which the art director, production designer had converted into a whole range of sets connected to a guy who bears a striking resemblance to Rupert Murdoch, a newspaper tycoon and media empire. And I ended up speaking to Michel Soubor, the actor in Godard's films, and then Edith Scobb, who was in Les Yeux Sans Visage by Georges Franju, which was one of my favorite films. I actually had a 2CV at the time. And in a 2CV is like prominent in Eyes Without a Face. And I called the car Edith in homage to this actress, Edith Scobb. And I was like starstruck when I met her. And for some reason I said, I named my car after you. And she sort of like gave me this horrified look and like walked off, which is the only sensible thing to do in that particular context. But yeah, it was an opportunity to see Andrzej direct a film, and it was fascinating. I had no other references as to how films are made. And I have to say, 25 years on, I've been on many film sets, and I've only come to appreciate that experience. Now I can contrast different experiences with that experience of watching Andrzej direct La Fidélité.
Did that do well? Or did that get a similar reception to Jamaica?
This was a French language production. It didn't play on the festival circuit because it featured Sophie Marceau. It was a big deal in France. So it was released, but I don't think it performed in the way anyone expected. They had a cast and crew premiere. I remember coming across for that. Andrzej was hiding in Warsaw. He didn't turn up. So I think he was bracing himself for the worst. I remember asking him, how did it perform? And his word was lukewarm. Unfortunately, the film was forced upon the UK distributor, Artificial Eye. They didn't want to take it, but the producer wanted to include it as a part of a batch of films. So Artificial Eye was founded by a German filmmaker called Andy Engel, and he programmed it in one cinema in London in Swiss Cottage. and didn't give it any advertising. This coincided with a French cinema season organized by, I think it was Martel, and they wanted a glamorous opening film, and Sophie Marceau's glamorous, so they chose to open this French film season with La Fidélité, and it was a disaster because they had a reception at the French ambassador's residence again, and Andy Engel, well, he was drunk on this occasion. He was going around to a friend of mine, David Thompson, who'd written a very positive article appraising Zulawski's films in Sight and Sound. He grabbed David and then spoke to Andrzej, be nice to this guy. He's your only friend. So it was a particularly volatile atmosphere. And when you have the distributor slagging off his own film with the director present, it really didn't give off a good vibe. So the reviews were terrible in England too. I remember Peter Bradshaw in The Guardian giving it 1 star. I think the way in which Peter wrote about the film probably said more about his understanding of cinema than it did Zulawski's, in the way that his main criticism was that Zulawski demonstrated a profound naivety when it came to the workings of the media. But I think if you look at the film, and if you look at all of Andrzej's films, he's not a realist. He's a surrealist. And I think that this particular film, as with many of his films, one of his passions were bande dessinée, which is not quite comic book. It's these French albums, which are hardbacks. They're a bit more serious than Marvel and DC, but they're stories nevertheless told without superheroes. They're just stories told in images and text in a very stylized form. And I think that was an important reference for Andrzej. So it was a sort of a comic book film which involved the media, which involved organ trafficking, which involved all sorts of things, but it's told in this slightly comic book fashion. So I think the film was misunderstood. But for me, I think it was really fascinating in terms of how Andrzej directed, because it really is stark contrast to a lot of the other film sets I've been on. He would literally be the first person on the set. He would get there before anyone else. And you would get to the set. I took the car with Sophie. I would meet and we would take the car together. And then Andrzej would be on the set, pacing around the set, basically working out how he was going to shoot the day. And then the cinematographer would arrive, a guy called Patrick Blossier. And then Andrzej would explain to Patrick how he was going to shoot each of the setups each of the day, throughout the whole day. And what Andrzej would do is completely the opposite to how most people direct films. Most people, they do coverage. So you have 1 or 2 cameras, you shoot things from different angles. And the reason you do that is to give yourself lots of choice in the editing room about how the scene will play out. And if you make a mistake, you can always cut to something else to like hide an edit or something like that. Andrzej didn't do that. He did no coverage. There was 1 camera angle, 1 shot. And it's a very high risk affair because if the shot doesn't work, you've got no escape routes. But on the other hand, he developed this technique, which is basically very choreographed, very precise. He hated what Roman Polanski called fruit salad filmmaking, when you shoot from lots of different angles and chop, 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 like a fruit salad. I think that this Polish school, Polanski, Zulawski, Borowczyk too, there's only 1 correct shot. If you read the script, there's only 1 angle to actually view a particular scene. And Andrzej developed an approach with his regular camera operator, who you know, Andrzej Jaroszewicz, who was the cinematographer of On the Silver Globe. And they called it mądre oko, so the wise eye, the intelligent eye. The idea that there's only 1 place, it's part of the action. It will look for the right position to capture the faces, the bodies of the actors. And it's not an option. There's only 1 angle. The question is where that angle is, and you incorporate the movement from point to point. So he developed an approach to cinema in which the camera is always moving. It's roving. It's always looking. It's following the actors. It's choreographed as if it was one of the actors. It's always looking for the right spot. In many ways, it's the opposite to, say, for example, a filmmaker like Ken Loach, who has an approach to the camera where he pretends that the film crew doesn't exist and it's sort of spying on the action. Andrzej thought this was ludicrous, the fact that it's completely false to pretend this enormous film crew doesn't exist. Therefore, the film crew should be part of the action. You shouldn't lie about the presence of the camera. In that first interview, he said something very memorable about Ken Loach. He said, "This guy you have, Ken Loach, he has everything. He has the ear for actors. He has the ear for dialogue. He has this wonderful talent for casting and directing actors. If only he could put the camera in the right place and instead of the wrong place, he would be the best director ever," which is an incredibly bitchy thing to say, but it also says a lot about Andrzej's approach to both other directors and his own cinema. It's also, I dare say, that it's got a grain of truth in it as well. That basically it is false to pretend. It's false to pretend that the camera is absent. It's like in theatre, it's with the fourth wall. It's false to pretend there is a fourth wall. It's false to pretend that there's a camera. So just as in theatre, which breaks the fourth wall, which acknowledges the audience, Andrzej had an approach towards acting where they acknowledge the camera. They often look directly into the camera, which is the opposite of this Ken Loach approach. I'm not saying one is right and the other's wrong, but these are formal opposite approaches towards the image and cinema, which is, I think, quite fascinating.
I wasn't aware of what you were saying about having one camera. It reminds me of The Devil. I won't say too much of a spoiler, but there is a point where one of the characters sets fire to a house and walks out, and so you're watching that and you can see like that's a real house on fire, and it looks like the actor just set fire to this old house. And it's a single shot where the camera's just following the guy setting fire to different curtains and stuff like that. But I'm assuming they did that. They burnt that house down and they just did that one take, because if you're saying they had one camera, they weren't going to have like a bunch of coverage shots, as you were, like in case one shot didn't work out. And they just filmed the guy setting fire to everything. And then there's a bunch of different external shots, but it is like the actual house burning down from what I could see.
Well, the first thing to say is that Andrzej pre-edited his films in the way that if you look at the screenplays and you know how Andrzej is going to shoot it, the edits are actually not stipulated in the script, but it's quite clear where they're going to be. And I think in a shot like that, his attitude would be, what's the point of actually having all these different close-ups and things? Why don't just get it in one go? It's much more powerful in that respect. And what you're describing is very similar to the final scene in Andrzej Tarkovsky's The Sacrifice, where indeed the camera did break down and they had to rebuild the house and set it on fire again. The difference between The Sacrifice and The Devil is that this is the communist period. There's no shortage of palaces in Poland, and you can always burn down another one. So I don't think anyone was worried about, if the camera did jam in Poland in 1972 and they burned the palace down, I'm sure they could have found another one very easily to do the same too. And I think that this is the difference between making films in Poland and making films in the West. The idea that these are state-financed and you were very poor in terms of resources, just as Grotowski was very poor in terms of what he had available in theatre, but you were very rich in terms of what you had at your disposal, which in this case were palaces. Sometimes the direct way is the best way. The infamous anecdote in on the Silver Globe when I was recording a commentary with Andrzej and commented on the crucifixion scene looking very realistic. And how did they do the effect when they hammer the nail through the hand? And Andrzej said, "Oh, it's very simple. We went to the morgue and we got a hand from a dead body and we just nailed into it." So yeah, welcome to special effects in Poland during the 1970s.
Well, it's cheaper, I guess, isn't it? Yeah, much cheaper. There's a next bit of the story is to do with Possession, and that reminds me as well that in Possession, there is a famous single shot with Isabella Gianni where she's just sort of screaming in a tunnel, which is used in all the trailers. But that's obviously another example of them just doing one camera. I'm assuming she didn't shoot that more than once.
They shot it twice,
yeah,
but they used the first take. And I think that there's two things to really understand about that. And the first is that it goes back to The Third Part of the Night, which is Andrzej's debut film. And because he was a debut filmmaker, and this was 1971, they wanted him to shoot in black and white, not for artistic reasons, but because black and white was cheaper. And Andrzej said, no, I see the film in color. I can't see the film in any other way. Now, at this time, Eastman Kodak was a traded good. It was coming into Poland across the Iron Curtain, but it was a finite resource. So it was reserved for the high-profile productions. And the agreement they came to is that, okay, you can shoot in color, but you basically have a 1-to-1 shooting ratio. So you can't drop any scenes, you can't do multiple takes. And this led to a system where basically Andrzej said, well, it was very simple. I'd have to rehearse the actors, rehearse the camera, and then make it very clear you only have one go. And he said that developed a shooting style, which he then carried over when he went to work in France, which was very economical in that respect. And it gave the film a very kind of a slick look, but with very limited means. But it also, I think, it gives it a formal quality. And I think this shot in possession, which you referred to, which is very famous, it really kind of crystallizes these 2 or 3 elements, which I think make Andrzej's cinema unique. And the first element is the performance, this unique performance, when she really does look like she's possessed. And secondly, it's how the camera is used to capture these performances. Now, in terms of that performance, Andrzej, I think, gave a brilliant piece of direction. He said to Isabella Gianni, the actress, fuck the air. And she does, she fucks the air. And now, of course, you don't know what's happening when you see the film, but when you know that piece of direction, it makes sense. I think it's a great piece of direction because it's giving the actor something very concrete to do, but at the same time, it's not obvious how to do it. So the actor has to work with that. And what makes that performance unique is that Gianni has the talent and the intelligence to take that piece of direction, the confidence in the film and herself to do something which is now iconic. I think Andrzej used to enjoy encouraging this idea which journalists promoted of being a kind of a Svengali type character who would cast a spell over actors, in particular actresses. But he was very open about this and saying that, yes, there is an element of trance in this, but it tends to be during the rehearsal phase. But at the end of the day, these performances hinge on actors being fantastically talented. And he said his only real talent was spotting which actors can act and which ones can't act. And he used to say, and it goes back to that first interview, that half of Paris has written in their identity cards, profession actor. And of course, most of them aren't actors. So if you can work out which ones can really act and do away with the ones who claim to act but can't, then you're left with these remarkable performances. And I think that was the essence of his career. He had the possibility to work with some really talented people, not just women, also men. And I think that's, if you look at the last film he made, Cosmos, the performance by Jean-François Balmer is incredible too. That really is the essence. But I think the problematic and fascinating part, and this goes back to Gombrowicz had this idea about what he called form. And the idea is that people are shaped by language, by society, by interaction with other people. And at the heart of this idea about form is that there is no authentic self. So it's the opposite of everything you see on Instagram and all of these inspirational memes, that you're being true to yourself, you're being authentic. No, Gombrowicz says that there's no such thing as an authentic self, that our personalities, our actions are shaped by other things. It's a bit similar to what Sartre was writing about in the 1950s. It predated Sartre by 20 years. These ideas were formulated by Gombrowicz in his first novel, Für die Döcke. And Andrzej, I think, applied that in real life, not just acting, but in real life. I think he translated that. He approached people, not just actors, but people in the same way that a potter works with clay. People were his medium. And I think this is really fascinating how he was able to take these ideas and apply them in real life. It's like he was, it's first person syndrome. He was a character in a Gombrowicz novel himself. He's very conscious of this. And if you look at a film which is playing in the season called La Femme Publique, which is about a director coercing a Czech dissident to carry out a political crime while the director is adapting a novel by Dostoevsky, Demons, which is about this very same subject. There is a sort of an awareness on Andrzej's part about this is exactly what I'm doing. One of his heroes was Orson Welles. And on a superficial level, you could say that you could look at Andrzej's style of his films, these long tracking shots, these wide angle lenses, these angles, and it's very Wellesian. You could say that the basic grammar of Andrzej's mature films are very similar to what Orson Welles was doing. His favorite Welles film, he didn't like the famous ones. He liked Mr. Arkadin and The Lady of Shanghai. And he liked the ending of The Lady of Shanghai, which everybody does with the Hall of Mirrors. But in Mr. Arkadin, there's this sequence where Welles is playing what seems to be a Georgian, but he has a backstory in Poland, in particular Warsaw during the war. And he's giving this talk, telling this anecdote at a party in Spain. And he tells what he says is an old Arab proverb about a frog and a scorpion. And in the proverb, the scorpion asks the frog to take him across the river. And the frog says, "That's crazy, you'll sting me." And the scorpion says, "That makes no sense, because if I sting you, we'll both drown." So the frog goes, "I'll go along with that." And the scorpion gets on the frog's back. And then as he's across the river, the frog feels a pain in his back and said, "What's the logic in that?" And then the scorpion goes, "I can't help it. It's my character." Now, Andrzej was born in November and he was a Scorpio. And I think he was very, very conscious of being a scorpion. I think he was very aware of stinging people, but like the scorpion in the anecdote, he was very aware that he couldn't help himself. And I think that this being honest about one's failings rather than making excuses, I think in Andrzej's mind gave it a sort of a noble dimension. And as you know from many of his horrifying books which he wrote, which are basically self-interrogations about not just his failings, but especially the failings of other people, it's very clear that this ruthless self-interrogation and interrogation of others, which again has a strong parallel with Gombrowicz, particularly the famous diaries, but also the personal diary of Gombrowicz, Kronos, which only appeared, about 13 years ago. So I think that, this is another parallel Andrzej had with Gombrowicz. So I would say really his cinema is a synthesis of this element of form in Gombrowicz's writings, combined with practically implementing this, which bears comparison with Grotowski, coupled with this incredible cinematic affinity, this ability to capture these performances with the moving camera. So I think that really is the essence of Andrzej's cinema. I think these things take precedence over the narrative aspects of his cinema. I think the best thing to do with the films is not try to make sense of them, not try to analyze the plot too much, but to experience the films, experience the performances, and enjoy the spectacle. I think that's the best approach to watching the 8 films which will be screened in London.
Firstly, thank you for that. It's a summary of his world. I think that makes a lot of sense. We're going to run out of time, but so thanks very much for chatting with me, Daniel. As you know, there is going to be a season of Andrzej Zulawski films in London. I think it's like the most thorough retrospective of Zulawski's films in the UK. So I think it's really great that the Garden Cinema is putting it on, and the PCI is obviously supporting it as well. We look forward to it.
Looking forward to catching up soon, and a pleasure as always to talk.
Thanks very much.